So this is definitely a series I've been uh, really into. I've already watched all of them before, but rewatching them again is almost watching them like the first time. Uh, I know there's one crazy one, and I don't know if it's part 19, part 20. I don't know exactly where it ends up in the listing, but to me, I mean, anybody's capable of doing it. What happens? But having family in a small little town like I did growing up, there were just certain things that were inaccessible to them as opposed to being more accessible to me since we lived uh, closer to the city. And, out where they lived, I mean, all you see are, you see the mountains far off to the west, just like you do pretty much anywhere you're at here in Colorado, unless you're way the hell out east. But you see the mountains out west. More you go north towards Wyoming is kind of like the area where my some of my extended family live, and all you smell out there is cow manure, and you become nose deaf. You don't even notice it after a while. But whenever you take somebody who's not used to it, right away they're like, "Oh, it stinks," and blah blah blah, and I'm like, "Oh, you'll get used to it." And sure as shit, no pun intended, they do get sick of it. So, um, what I'm trying to say is that with these men caught, it's just I find it to be, I'm hard pressed to say that they faked it. I'm not calling them stupid. I'm not calling them mountain men, rednecks, anything like that. No. They're hunters. They're built for survival. They're built for, knowing knowing the land. I mean, they're very smart men. But what they caught would definitely require a George Lucas like mind. And that's very creative to have captured what they did. Now, I don't want to spoil the secret for everybody. That's why I'm leaving, out exactly what they captured. Um, but when it does come up, I'll be super stoked to see it again because the first time I seen it, I had that on rewind. I'm like, I got to see it again. I got to see this again. I got to see this again. I mean, it was that crazy to me. I'm like, wow, that I was not expecting that. And so, with evidence, they were able to determine, they don't know what species of animal this is, but yeah, it's crazy. So we're gonna continue with Mr. Ballen's uh, coverage of David Palidues' missing 411. I'll probably do the two-part series like I have the other ones. This will be part 19, part 20. And a quick disclaimer, if this is your first time on my channel, thank you. I definitely appreciate it that you're taking the time out of your evening to, watch uh, another person on YouTube reacting to a video. I'm not really the type that's always, telling people like and subscribe. If you like the content, you're more than welcome to. If you think I'm bland or boring, that's okay too. It's always, I respect everybody's opinion. Um, so, with that being said, the next disclaimer is all my videos up until the end of June, and I should just type this out really, but all my videos up to the end of June have always been on my YouTube premium account. For a living, I'm an actor. I just finished wrapping my first feature-length film that will be submitted into film festivals and be out in theaters. And I also filmed 2 commercials for YouTube. I've been dying to see the ones for YouTube just because the concept behind it is funny. That's all. You know, you have to sign a NDA, of course, for anything that you do, and so that's about the most I could divulge. You know, I want to. It's just interesting to see how they went about editing it. What kind of music there might be in the background. Are they going to make you look corny and cheesy? Because that certainly wasn't the case in the movie I'm in. I got rave reviews from the director himself, which is just that made my day, and also the assistant director were just blown away. Which honestly, I fucked up that audition so bad, and they gave me a chance still. And wherever my career may go, if it goes up, up, and up to where, you know, I don't know where it's going to go. I had the drive to be in the music industry, and I achieved that goal. I never had the slightest bit of an inclination to become an actor. I took acting classes just as a way to, you know, fill up, you know, my free time. And I was never once expecting in my life to be in a movie, let alone a feature-length movie that is going to be in, you know, that's not going straight to, you know, Blu-ray or DVD, but that's actually going to film festivals. And the concept behind it is just, it's awesome. And so I don't know exactly where I'm going to land on my feet with this whole acting thing. You make pretty good money for a little bit of your time, which is awesome. But, you know, if taking on bigger roles, it's not that difficult if you put your work in. You know what I mean? Like, I think, let's see. And you really can't see much, but I mean, this was the script for what I just did, and I mean, it's, you know, spiral bound and everything, and it looks empty, but I could probably just do this, blank that out. Now you guys can still see it. Let's just say it looks blank from here. I don't know why. The light. There we go. That's about the most I could show. And I seriously doubt that you guys will be able to discern what was there. But when you're having to memorize this much stuff, it could get pretty tedious. And so that's what scares me. Of course, and even Robert Downey Jr., one of the greatest actors ever, when he portrayed the black character on Tropic Thunder, I had no clue that was him. Zero. And when it was him, I was like, oh my God, he's fucking amazing, man. This dude is crazy good. But he has admitted to wearing earpieces where they just feed the lines to him. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, because he's still performing. He's still doing his job extremely, extremely well. And so Yeah, you definitely don't want to go into it overthinking, and that's what I did on the audition. I went into it way overthinking. I froze up like a deer in headlights. I was like, shit, I know I already fucked this up. And I kind of walked out of there with my head low. 2 days later, I get a call from the director. And I really thought, and I said it in a jokingly way, I'm like, yeah, if you need a towel boy or a cleaner for the set, I'm all in on that. And of course he laughed, and he's like, no, we want to go ahead and offer you the role. And I'm like, and it just slipped out. I'm like, you got to be fucking kidding me. I'm like, I don't know if you're a sports fan, but do you remember the infamous Allen Iverson practice? It was practice, man. Practice. Come on. That's how I kind of almost felt like what mattered was what I was going to do on the final product. And to get that kind of review from the director who, he's not going to bullshit you. He's going to tell you how it is. If I were doing a terrible job that day, he would have been like, you know what? I need you to step it up. I need you to do this. You're the main focus for the day. Everybody's time is dependent on you. So, let's see what we, let's see what we can do. And I made it short and simple. And of course, they'll have you do multiple takes to get the right angles. So when they go in the editing room, they have multiple options. Whereas opposed to a commercial, it's usually just from, one angle straight on or off to the side a little bit. And it's supposed to be, this is supposed to be completely different from the movie. This is definitely more, it's supposed to be funny. And since I've always been a class clown, but since I've never done, many funny parts before, I'm just very interested to seeing it. And so if you see ads on my page, that is why. Of course, they don't give, the talent, give us any type of, a pre-copy of what they're going to be releasing. So just like anyone else, we have to wait until it's released. And so as soon as it's released, my word, there will be absolutely no more advertisements. So again, I apologize in advance that there are even some showing up, because it could really wreck a good story, and I'm sorry about that. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into part 19 and part 20.
Stalking through these trees.
Go back there.
So, what's the secret? How have you guys made it work so long?
We have a deep, almost spiritual connection.
Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions inside the woods of North America. I'm talking about people being right in front of someone and then in a second they're gone and they're never found again. Or somebody goes missing and then they're found again, but in a location that's impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Palidues has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 of his cases that, even amongst strange disappearances, these stand out as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're have a flow within. Also, please, all right, let's get into today's stories. Hours of January 12th, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was attending a party in his hometown of Osborne, Idaho. Towards the end of the night, Dylan decided he wanted to leave the party, but it was snowing and cold outside, so he called his mom and he asked her if she would come pick him up at the gas station just down the road from the house he was at. His mother would say it was obvious Dylan had been drinking because he was slurring his words, but at the time, even though she was upset about it because he was underage, she thought, you know what, it's cold, it's snowing, I just want to get my kid home safe and we'll deal with this tomorrow. So she agreed to pick him up. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm going to be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. Calm down. I'll be there in a minute. And then he hung up. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. When she tried calling him back, his phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't. She got back in the car and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, but there was no sign of him. She still couldn't get in touch with him. His phone was still off, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine, and he just left. He said he was getting picked up by his mom. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by two people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs, and that's when they found Dylan's body. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. Now, toxicology reports showed Dylan had been under the influence of alcohol, but this was his hometown. He certainly knew where the gas station was, and he would have known he was walking in the complete wrong direction, especially when you consider walking towards the gas station was like walking towards the center of town. There was lots of lights, lots of indication you're going in the right direction. To walk in the other direction towards that hill where he was found would have been like walking towards darkness, where there's no lights, there's no sign of town. It's obviously the wrong direction. But the case gets even stranger, because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. And from the time Dylan went missing until he was found, it didn't snow, and the temperature did not heat up enough to melt the snow. So in theory, any tracks Dylan would have made, they would still be there when he was found. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. And so you would think for him to make it all the way up to this spot on the hillside through kind of rough, rocky, snowy terrain through a forest, that you would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up. But his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks. And then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed and he thought Dylan had been attacked. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. David says they fired him to keep him quiet. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. Dustin Self was born and raised in Piedmont, Oklahoma, which is a small community just northwest of Oklahoma City. Growing up, Dustin had always been kind of a mediocre performer with so-so grades, didn't take things too seriously, but in his senior year, he discovered weightlifting, and it seemed to give his life a much-needed sense of purpose, and it really kind of helped him organize all aspects of his life. So by the time he was graduating, he was not only in great physical shape, he had also managed to raise all of his grades up significantly, and he seemed to be on a path to success. But interestingly, after high school, he didn't pursue higher education, he didn't go get a job, he didn't try to spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he decided he wanted to go live in the wild. His family believed this was due to his obsession with the Hollywood film Into the Wild, which is about the true story of Christopher McCandless, who gives up a promising career to go live off in the wilds of Alaska. Christopher would ultimately die in the wilds of Alaska after eating a poisonous plant, or some say he died from starvation.
So, what's the secret? How have you guys made it work so long?
We have a deep, almost spiritual.
So about a year after Dustin's high school graduation, he was 19 years old. It was March of 2013. He finally felt like he was ready to go live out this dream of living in the wild.
You know what's so funny is, and it's, well, funny for me, but one of the stories that we heard last night was a group of 3 guys went and hiked the Appalachian Trail, and they got caught in a really bad snowstorm. Well, first it was like heavy rain, then snowstorm, and one of the guys just knew it, just had a bad feeling, and said, you know what, I'm just going to go back to the car and stay inside. I'll be here when you guys, get back. And because the storm was so severe, along the trail, people will often leave, like, goodie, what do they call them? Like a survival kit. And, you take what you need, and you almost like give a penny, take a penny. Same concept. But this time it's with cabins. And they're just mediocre cabins. They don't even have heat inside these cabins, but they at least protect you from the elements. And as long as you have your sleeping bag, you're good. And the storm was so severe that I can't recall if the young man died or not, but he was within 300 yards of the cabin right in front of him, and he didn't see it just because of how hard it was snowing. I mean, just imagine that. He kept on saying to himself, okay, it should be showing up any minute now. It's going to be showing up any minute. Never did. And to me, that's just like heartbreaking. I'm like, wow, that really, really sucks. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Wild. And so he told his family he was going to go on this cross-country road trip, stopping at different points along the way, living out in the woods. His family knew he was really fixated on this and couldn't talk him out of it, and so they ultimately accepted it and said, just be really careful. So in early March, Dustin heads out on this road trip, and nobody hears from him until March 15th, when he calls his parents and says, I'm in this tiny town called Fields, Oregon, and I'm at a gas station. Everything's going great, nothing to worry about. The very next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend and told her he was lost on a mountain. And his ex-girlfriend said she couldn't really understand what he was saying, and she was actually at the airport about to board a plane, so it was noisy, and she stepped into a bathroom to hear him more clearly. But even as she's hearing him, what he was saying just wasn't making any sense. He was talking about this mountain he was lost on, and he was referencing that there were people that were after him, and it was just very confusing. And before she could get any more clarifying information from Dustin, he hung up, and then she couldn't get back in touch with him. So she calls Dustin's father, and she tells him that she had this really weird conversation with Dustin where he said he's lost on this mountain. And even though I didn't really understand what he was telling me, he sounded really, really scared. Dustin's father thanked her and then spent the rest of the day trying to get in touch with his son, but every time he called, it just went straight to voicemail. The next day, when he still hadn't heard from his son, he called the police. The police did not have a great idea of where to start looking for him because Dustin did not specify to his ex-girlfriend what mountain he was actually lost on. All they had was his last known location, which was that gas station in Fields, Oregon. So they went to that gas station and he wasn't there, and they asked the people that worked there if they remembered Dustin, and they didn't, and no one knew anything about him. And so after that, they just had to wait for more leads to come in because they couldn't just, search all the mountains in Oregon for Dustin. They would never find him. A month later, after no one's heard from Dustin, a ranch hand who was living in a very rural section of Oregon, not far from the gas station in Fields, Oregon, discovered Dustin's truck parked precariously on the edge of this road inside of a canyon. It was abandoned, but inside were Dustin's GPS, some food, and some energy drinks. His backpack that contained his sleeping bag and his tent were missing. There was a comprehensive search done around where the truck had been found, but after a couple of days, nothing had been found and the search was terminated. The area around where Dustin's truck was found was very hilly and rocky, but there weren't that many trees, which meant if you were standing on one of the different mountains in the area, you'd be able to very easily look out and actually see a road.
That's one of the things that I've often said. I hope to God that I'm never in one of those positions, but to have someone go missing and not know is just, I couldn't even imagine. I mean, one of the few times that you're hoping, you know, if they're dead, I could at least get some peace. But you don't know. So there's always that little tiny glimmer of hope that, hey, they actually might be alive. And I believe MrBallen tells the story about a young girl who faked her disappearance for 5 years from her parents. And her mom and her dad were, you know, basically feeling the way what I'm talking about. And she was only, I think, 4 blocks away from them. But she had changed her look dramatically. She cut her hair. She dyed it. Every single curtain in the house was closed. She didn't go outside until, like, you know, it was dark. Her boyfriend had to go and grab everything for her. I mean, just totally ridiculous. That makes you wonder, like, what? Like, okay, I get teenage love, but why to that level? That I'll never understand. But yeah, it was something else.
And so the searchers were thinking to themselves, how could this guy have gotten lost on any of these mountains? Because all he'd have to do is look over there and there's a road and therefore there's help. 6 months later, a hunter was up in those mountains near where Dustin's truck was found. And he was actually moving through one of these small sections of aspen trees. And as he was walking through, he thought he saw a deer, and he was kind of stalking through these trees. And he gets to an opening where he looks down and he stops, because underneath the bush is an obviously dead man, not wearing any clothes, who's on his hands and knees, and it looks like his head is stuck in the ground. When the hunter walks over to get a better look, it looks like this guy must have pushed his head into a hole in the ground before he succumbed to whatever killed him. The hunter leaves and tells police. Police show up, they search the area, and they find a jacket nearby, inside of which is a wallet that contains Dustin's ID cards, as well as Dustin's car keys. The body was Dustin's. Dustin was located 9 miles away from where his truck had been parked on that road, and nowhere in the area did they find a campsite. They actually never found his backpack that contained the tent or the sleeping bag, so they think he never set up camp, but they don't know where his supplies went. After Dustin's family found out what happened to him, his father would say, I just don't understand why he didn't seek shelter in his vehicle. It was parked on the road, he wasn't that far away. Heck, he could have run those 9 miles. He was in great physical shape, and in theory, he would have known where he parked it, or if he didn't, he could have just walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out and seen the road it was parked on. So the family just couldn't understand his decision making. Investigators would say there was no indication Dustin was trying to hurt himself and foul play was ruled out. So what was it that caused Dustin to abandon his car and walk 9 miles uphill and ditch his clothes and ditch his backpack that contained his tent and his sleeping bag and then stick his head in a hole until he died? The only thing that could be determined was that Dustin probably died of hypothermia, but because of the state his body was in from decomposition, the coroner said, we don't know for sure.
I feel like I'm spending way too much time dealing with other people's problems.
I gotta grab my glasses. Give me one moment. Very, very rarely do I wear my glasses, but I had to put them on today to, like I said, I have what I would consider a pretty great comic book collection. After I got a divorce, I found out my ex had opened up 18 credit cards behind my back, and I had zero clue. When I lost the key to the mailbox, which my brother installed for us at our house, we had a house in the Suburbans. I thought nothing of it. You know, I'm going walking every night. I'm like, oh, I could have fell off or something. And so it was funny because anytime the mail came, I just didn't think anything of it. You know, you're supposed to believe that your spouse has your best interest in mind. And so she's not telling me about the credit card she's opening up because she has all my information. And she made, and if she's still working there, she makes a shitload of money. We're talking about 6 figures a year, maybe close to even 7. But another thing she didn't tell me was that she was married before me. And another thing she didn't tell me was that she was having an affair with me, which I would never, ever, ever fucking condone. That shit pissed me off like none other because I know what it feels like to be heartbroken. And I know I go tell these long stories before I get to the point of where I'm getting at, and that's what I'm doing. So, during mediation, the judge, of course, said, you know, you're going to have to pay that back because the charges were clear. You know, no man is going to be shopping at Sephora's or Mac. Definitely not Nordstrom's kind of person. And on top of that, it's all revolving credits. So me having a credit score of, like in the low 800s, she just fucked it all up to high hell. So when I got her, what they ended up doing was, instead of her paying me out, monthly, I got her TSP plan, her thrift savings plan, because we both worked for the government at one time. And I went wild. I bought the first Iron Man, Tales of Suspense 39, it's called. Justice League of America #1, Avengers #1. Avengers 4, which is the first Captain America, Hulk 181, New Mutants 98, Secret Wars 8. I mean, anybody who's, a comic book fan will know. And I had been missing this one so much that I was like, oh man, I gotta go and get this one. Because the cover of it is just so freaking cool. So let me exit out of this, just so I could see. Look at how cool this cover is. I mean, he looks menacing right there. And so, yeah, here I was like a nerd with my glasses, like inspecting the corners, seeing if there was any little, dents or marks or anything, so I could get it graded and see where I could land at with it. But yeah, that was half my story of useless information about a person I shouldn't have married that ultimately led into a comic book story. So, and explain my glasses all at the same time. So sorry for ranting and raving there, but yeah, I just wanted to get that off my chest because I don't like wearing glasses, but when I start having my allergy problems and stuff, it's really, really hard. And yeah, this has only happened, and I expected it to. It happens with age. So, anyways, let's get back to where we were.
How do I set boundaries with them?
So like all the other missing 411 cases, we're left with lots of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry. And periodically, she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, "The woods just went completely silent. Very odd." As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. She just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head, and as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds.
I don't know how many of you guys like the topic of UFOs, aliens, things like that. But there's a strong correlation between UFOs and Bigfoot sightings. They tend to happen relatively close to one another, almost as if, and this is I know it sounds preposterous when somebody says it, but just from what I have been listening to from Coast to Coast AM to just about, Zachariah Stishin, J. Allen Hynek, I mean, you name it, any freaking UFO, now UAP, people, or MUFON. Tom DeLonge, in fact, Tom DeLonge is, of course, one of the front men of Blink-182. He was a guitar player. That was my favorite band. On Enema of the State, one of their songs is called Aliens Exist. And he had a profound alien experience that he completely just... Blink-182 is technically still together, but he's gone on to do other projects, and he actually opened up this academy called To the Stars, and its main focus is about UFOs. And there's an interesting interview with him, and also a variant. If you like Joe Rogan's podcast, I would suggest typing in Joe Rogan with Dan Aykroyd, and that's like 2.5 hours long. Pretty damn crazy. And it gave him the idea for Ghostbusters when he wrote it. And there's also, God, who else was I going to say? Damn it, it skipped my mind. Dan Aykroyd and Tom DeLonge. God, I was just talking about him forever. I mean, the whole discussion was about aliens. And so there's that correlation there with aliens and Bigfoots, and people think that's why we can't find them. You got to realize the vastness of the lands that haven't been explored. And not a lot of people are going into these areas to where they could find bones. They're not just going to, pop up and be like, oh, look, here's some, Bigfoot bones. Yay, I validated it. I mean, there's so many places untouched. Even here in Colorado, when you go off the trail, go off the beaten path, like they would say, and deep, 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 deep into the forest where your survival skills have to be a 10. And perhaps maybe you might find something then, and might find something you didn't want to find. But nonetheless, do I believe? I do. And the reason why, when multiple cultures are explaining the same thing over and over again, that makes me really think like, okay, there's something there. But when it comes to ghosts, because I also enjoy listening to the paranormal, it always seems like the videos of ghosts always are dependent of what they depict in their country. So, like, Japanese love ghosts, videos, and a lot of their videos are, of very pale, ghosts with dark hair, black sunken in eyes, that are staring at them. Whereas more often in America, we see shadow people, So that one's a little harder for me to put together, but it's still interesting to me nonetheless.
And then at some point, the light kind of went back into the forest, and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened, and it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing, and as soon as he finishes, she says, "What time did he say that happened?" Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him, and so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, "It was between 7:50 and 8. Why?" At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, "Here, let me take a look at it." As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, "Well, did your hair get in front of the lens?" And she said, "No, I was holding it about a foot away from my head, and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair." And so he looked at it again, and he asked her, "Well, did you put your finger over the lens, maybe?" And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, like, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us a timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section.
All right, so let's go to number 20. I gotta admit, that alone looks pretty freaky.
Racetech's multi-pad design allows for easy installation without all the hassles or mess of toxic epoxy coatings.
Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America. One former police detective named David Palidues has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 cases from the Missing 411 that might shed a light on what's behind all these strange disappearances. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's house on a really hot day and ask them to get you a cold drink. While they're away, hide a large raw salmon in their haze. While they're away, hide a large raw salmon. I can feel it. I can feel it coming on. While they're away, hide a large raw salmon in the AC vent. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. West Townshend is a rural area on the east side of Glastonbury Mountain in the American state of Vermont. This is significant because that places West Townshend in the so-called Bennington Triangle, which is apparently one of the most haunted places in America. The Triangle is a loosely defined area that encompasses the ghost town Glastonbury, which used to be a small logging community centered on the eponymous mountain in southwestern Vermont. The town was abandoned at the end of the 19th century after the logging boom died down, so as a result, the greater Glastonbury area that West Townshend is certainly a part of is now untouched, pristine wilderness that even by Vermont standards is incredibly rugged and remote. The Triangle has earned its spooky reputation due in large part to the alarming number of unexplained disappearances that have occurred there over the last 100 years. Furthermore, over those 100 years, there have been dozens of sightings of the so-called Bennington Monster, which is apparently this 8-foot tall creature that roams the mountains of Glastonbury, and some people people think that creature is behind many, if not all, of these strange disappearances. On November 23rd, 1943, 37-year-old Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to go to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. At some point during their hunt, the pair got separated, and Henry spent some time yelling for Carl and looking around for him, but he couldn't find him, and so he assumed he must have gone back to their camp. But when Henry got back to camp, it was empty, and Henry waited around for a little while for Carl, but he had this sinking feeling that something was wrong, and so relatively quickly, he left to get police. Police show up, they launch the search. For 3 days, they combed the entire area, and there was just not a sign of Carl anywhere. On the third day, Henry discovered Carl's body. He was lying motionless face down in a clearing in the woods. Initially, Henry thought maybe he was still alive, so he ran over to him and rolled him over, and very quickly realized that no, Carl was deceased. However, there weren't any obvious injuries to Carl's body. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry looked around the area and he found Carl's rifle that was loaded leaning up against a tree 70 feet away from where Carl was. Next to his rifle on the ground was an expended shell casing. Also, around Carl's body were apparently huge bear tracks. The official cause of death was baffling. Carl, apparently, was squeezed to death to the point where his rib broke and punctured his lung. So the theory became Carl must have been out here by himself. He encountered a black bear. He fired one shot at the black bear. Thinking it was down, he walked over to check, and the bear attacked him and squeezed him and killed him. The end. But not so fast. If Carl encountered a black bear and fired one shot into the animal based on the one found shell casing, that one shot is not going to be enough to put that animal down. Or very rarely is one shot going to be enough to put down a black bear. And Carl, being a hunter, he would know that. And he would want to keep some distance with his weapon up aimed at the animal in case he needed to fire again. But even if Carl was really confident that one shot had taken the bear down, well, why would he risk his life by checking on the animal to make sure it's down without his gun? Why did he place it against a tree and then walk 70 feet over to this animal that if it's not dead, it poses an enormous threat to you? You're all alone and unarmed with a huge bear that you've shot? No one's going to do that. You're going to carry your gun. But even if all of that happened, that Carl, unarmed, approached this bear thinking it was dead, but the bear's not dead, he's lying in wait, and he leaps up and attacks Carl. Even if that happened, black bears don't squeeze people to death. They might scratch you and bite you and rip you to pieces, but they don't squeeze you to death. And Carl only had light scratching on his wrists and on his hands. He did not have any signs of a traditional bear attack. So either this is the first time in the history of black bears that a black bear squeezed a person to death, or something else squeezed Carl. But what kind of an animal is, one, so strong it can squeeze a man's chest to the point where it breaks his ribs, and two, happens to be roaming around the Bennington Triangle? Makes you wonder.
Let's talk about the importance of taking care of your mental health. The key to great therapy is finding a therapist you can truly.
Ape Canyon is a gorge on the southeast portion of Mount St. Helens in the American state of Washington. The canyon is so named after a group of miners alleged that ape men, aka Bigfoot, attacked their cabin there in 1924. And if you want to look...
No, it's not it. I thought it was it. It might be, but...
learn more about that specific event, I covered it on my YouTube channel in an earlier video. It's right here. It's called Scariest Bigfoot Attacks, and I'll also include a link in the description. And while some people believe there are literally ape men running around this gorge on Mount St. Helens, there's never been a confirmed sighting. However, there was an event in 1950 that forced the general public to come to terms with the idea that there could be ape men running around Ape Canyon, or at least a large predator somewhere out there. In 1950, 32-year-old Jim Carter was a member of the National Ski Patrol at a ski area called the Milwaukee Bowl, which is in the state of Washington. Like everybody else on the ski patrol, Jim was a highly skilled skier and mountaineer. In May of that year, Jim was a part of a 20-person climbing party from Seattle, Washington. Their plan was to go to Mount St. Helens, hike up above the tree line, pick a spot, and then ski back down again. So the group arrives at Mount St. Helens, they hike up the mountain, they reach the spot where they want to ski down from, they sit down, they're putting their skis on, and Jim puts his on, and he says to the group, hey, why don't I ski down a little ways, I'll set up my camera on a tripod, and I'll take a picture of you guys as you pass, and then I'll follow you down to the bottom. And the group said, great, that sounds awesome. And Jim wanted to use his camera, so it was a win-win. So Jim, in full view of the entire group as they're getting ready, he skis down a little ways and then turns left into an area called Dog's Head, which was a little bit flatter than the area they were in, so probably a better spot to set up his tripod. But as soon as he turned left into that area, he was out of view of the main group. So after a few minutes, as the group is getting their stuff on, they took a little bit longer because they're trying to time it so they all leave at the same time because they want to get this picture all at once. And so they take a little bit extra time, they're all ready, and then finally they head down and they make that left. They're going to pass by Dog's Head specifically so Jim can take their picture. But when they bank around the corner, Jim's not there. And so they're looking around and they're saying to each other,
guys.
did he...
I'm so sorry for this. There's gonna be a brief pause. You guys won't even know it. But it won't take very long, so. Alright, I am eager to see the rest of this. So sorry about that pause, guys.
Tell us he was going somewhere else? Because it seemed an awful lot like he was going to Dog's Head, but obviously he's not here. And so someone said, well, maybe he got annoyed with us because we were taking so long to get ready up there and he just already went to the bottom. And so they agreed that's what he did. And so they got back together again and they headed down to the bottom. But when they got to the bottom, Jim wasn't there. And so they sat there for a few extra minutes looking up at the mountain, and they're kind of scanning down at the bottom, and they're looking all over the place, but there's no sign of Jim. And so the group started to get really worried, and they contacted authorities. When the first search team arrived, they went up to the area where the group thought Jim had been setting up at Dog's Head. And as they were looking around, all they could find was this discarded film box. So not any film or camera inside, just a box that would have held the film. It was kind of buried in the snow. Near this film box, they found Jim Carter's ski tracks, and they were not angled south towards the bottom of the mountain where the whole ski group had gone. They were angled east towards Ape Canyon. And they followed Jim's tracks, and they said they never deviated. They were total straight lines, like he was not trying to slow down. In fact, he was trying to go as fast as he possibly could. And at some point, he began leaping over these huge ice crevasses that if you mistimed, it's a death sentence. You're going into the crevasse. And he didn't just jump over one. He jumped over 2, 3, 4 at full speed without slowing down. And then his tracks got all the way to the edge where it overlooked Ape Canyon, and he went flying off. When the head of the search team saw this crazy ski line from Jim Carter, he said to the media that the only reason a guy like Jim, an expert skier who would never take risks like this, the only reason he would be skiing like this is if his life was in danger or if he was being pursued. So the search teams moved down into Ape Canyon, and for 5 days, 75 people combed the entirety of Ape Canyon up and back over and over and over again. They never found Jim, and they never found his skis or his camera or anything. And the whole time they were looking, those 75 searchers would report that anytime they were alone, they had the distinct feeling they were being watched. And it got so uncomfortable for many of them that they refused to go back into the gorge unless they had someone right next to them. After those 5 days of searching almost exclusively inside of Ape Canyon, they spent another 5 days not only continuing to search Ape Canyon, but also the surrounding areas. And finally, after 10 days of finding no trace of Jim Carter, the search was terminated. The only rational thing investigators could point to as the reason behind why this happened to Jim was he was diabetic and he had forgotten his insulin that day, so perhaps he became hypoglycemic and he became confused and then managed to ski off the cliff into Ape Canyon, where he landed in such a way that he remained hidden. Or, like the head of the search party seems to think, he was being pursued. He was skiing for his life. Whatever was chasing him had scared him so badly that he was skiing in a straight line down a cliff, jumping over ice crevasses before falling into Ape Canyon. And then presumably whatever forced him off the edge went down and scooped him up and took him away, and that's why they couldn't find him. But unless someone finds his body or finds some other piece of compelling evidence, we will probably never know for sure what happened to Jim Carter.
Is this it? This might be it.
Somewhere out in the Sierra Nevada mountain range lies a small hunting camp that's been there since...
I love this one. This is exactly the one that I was talking about. So, not calling anyone dumb. I'm not calling anyone stupid. But it, to me personally, if I were to go out with a bunch of, mountain men who are used to the elements, who know how to survive, and I'm giving my 2 cents, it wouldn't be worth a damn. But flip that around and listen to what these guys caught. All of them are middle-aged men, and this is really before, you know, I think computers were starting to become more and more popular around this time. I can't recall, but they did have the sounds checked by one of the local colleges, and it doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard. It doesn't sound like anything that these men could possibly fake. And so to me, this is the most compelling, most realistic Bigfoot videos I've ever seen.
Since the 1950s. Despite its fame, only a handful of people know exactly where this camp is. But even if you were given explicit directions on how to get there, you might just walk past it because it's tucked away in the middle of the woods up on this mountain. It's just a small fire pit, a couple of logs around it, another log set up for cutting wood, and there's some paths that have been beaten down over the years from its occupants, but it's pretty much unremarkable. According to camp members, the fastest way to get to the site is by horseback, and it's approximately 8 miles, and it's through very rugged terrain on this mountain, and it includes a 4,000-foot elevation gain. However, this 8-mile trail is not marked, and every year it changes slightly because trees will fall along the way, changing the topography. Ron Moorhead, who's one of the 4 original camp members, laments the fact that anybody knows anything about this campsite. He wishes they could have kept it a secret, but he knew that wasn't an option after what they discovered there in late 1971. In early 19...
Okay, so computers weren't really... I mean, they were invented, but they weren't very... You know, they were just these massive machines at the time. I don't even recall. Excuse me, guys. I apologize. I don't even recall the first personal home computer, so I don't know.
1971, Ron was a young man, and he was invited out for the first time to the Sierra camp by the 3 founding members. When Ron got there, he fell in love. It was this beautiful, natural, pristine wilderness that overlooked this amazing valley, and they're surrounded by these huge white fir trees. There's a freshwater stream that trickled by, and in terms of hunting, the deer were plentiful. Ron said this campsite was the closest to heaven he thinks he'll ever get. The only real drawback of the site was the large bear population, but they always had guns on them, and they built this shelter out of heavy fallen timbers that they could go inside, shut the door, and they'd be protected from the bears until they left. When there wasn't a bear threat, they slept on the ground in tents. In late 1971, Ron came back to the camp with the other 3 founding members. They'd had a great day of hunting, and they were standing around the campfire just chatting with each other when they started hearing a grunting sound not far away from them in the forest. Now, typically, whenever a bear came to their campsite, it was usually at night, and they would hear it grunting somewhere off in the forest. And as soon as they heard it, they would stop and they would listen to kind of confirm it was a bear. And if it was, they would go inside of their shelter and they would wait for it to leave. But this time, when they stopped to listen to confirm it was a bear, the sound they heard next was something they had never heard before. And it was so frightening, they almost fell over each other running to get inside of the shelter. It was like a whooping sound you would expect from an ape, except instead of a series of whoops like you would expect from an ape, it was one loud whoop, and then silence, and then another creature somewhere else made a responding whoop that sounded different than the first. There was at least 2 creatures that were basically speaking to each other out in the forest out of view. Ron would say, as these creatures were howling and whooping at each other out in the forest, the men were huddled around inside of the shelter looking at each other like, what is that? Has anybody heard that sound before?
Crazy.
And nobody knew what it was. And after a little while, they heard these creatures running towards the camp. They were pretty well off, but they heard these heavy footsteps approaching. And so Ron and the others, they put themselves up against these slats inside of the shelter where they could look out in the direction where these creatures were, and they're staring out just past the light of their campfire into the dark forest, and they hear these things running, and they stop. They don't come into the clearing. It's like they're just outside of where they could see, and then their tone completely changes. These creatures, which are now one on one side of the camp and one on the other, begin speaking to each other in a language that almost sounds human, but it was nonsensical. It sounded like an imitation of a human language, but not human. And so Ron and the others are terrified, and they're just staring through the slats, waiting to see this creature that's going to emerge at some point, but it never does. Instead, the creatures continue to stay outside of the light and they move around behind their shelter out of view. And so Ron and the others move to the very middle of their shelter to get as far away from the walls as they can, because there are breaks in the walls and they're worried one of these things is going to reach through and grab them. But finally, after hours of these creatures running around the perimeter of their camp, communicating in this totally otherworldly language, they started whooping again and ran off. And for the rest of the night, Ron and the other three stayed right in that shelter. The next day, when the sun came up, the men were out of that camp as fast as they could. These are hard, rugged men, and they were very shaken up by this experience. And they tried to talk about it, but there was just no way to describe what they were hearing and experiencing. And so they just decided they just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, and they'll deal with this later. But as soon as they got out of the woods and back to their homes, they didn't talk about it anymore, except Ron became obsessed with whatever it was that was making that sound. He so desperately wanted to find out what it was. And so he convinced the other three members to come with him and go back to the campsite, except this time Ron was going to bring an audio recorder and he was going to try to capture some audio of these creatures. And so the four men went back to the campsite. They didn't even hunt that day. They stayed right near the campsite. They made this big fire and they're all just kind of nervously sitting there waiting, kind of hoping it happens and also hoping it doesn't happen. And at some point in the evening, Ron said he heard footsteps way out in the middle of the forest and they sounded like they were running towards the camp. The four men sprint inside the shelter, lock it behind them, and Ron turns on the audio recorder. Now, before you listen to this famous...
Now, I also want to point out, once again, these are mountain men. I honestly, truly believe that they didn't have the education or schooling to do or mimic something like this. It is so crazy when you hear it.
Recording, here are its bona fides. After being recorded, Ron sent it to Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, who is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, and he and his team analyzed it, and they concluded that, one, it was unaltered, so it's not been edited, it's not been doctored in any way, it's an authentic audio recording. And two, whatever was making the sounds could not have been a man, because their vocal range was dramatically higher and lower than that of a human's. The doctor said, based on average pitch and tract length, the creature that was making the sound most likely was between 7'3" and 8 feet tall. In addition to the Dr. Curlin examination, a cryptolinguist expert named Scott Nelson also pointed out that it would have been nearly impossible in 1971 for Ron or any of the other hunters to dub the sound of their voices, which are on the recording, over the sounds that these creatures were making. Because a couple times in the recording, you hear both sets of voices happening at once. That's something you couldn't have done in 1971. Despite numerous attempts to debunk this recording, it still stands as a legitimate, unedited recording. Although what they were recording is still a mystery. Have a listen.
Two of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
He sounds like he talks to others and they talk to each other.
Yeah. Right there, just seems to go right through there.
Shortly after this recording...
Okay, so I want to play that again. It is the craziest sounds that I've ever heard out of any type of Bigfoot documentary or recordings. I mean, it's something else.
Recording, it still stands as a legitimate, unedited recording. Although what they were recording is still a mystery. Have a listen.
There's two of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
He sounds like he talks to others and they talk to each other.
Yeah. Right there, just seen moving right through there.
Shortly after this recording was made, Ron stopped hunting at this camp. However, over the years, he has gone back several times because he's obsessed with trying to find out what's out in the forest. But he says to this day, he still has no idea. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please go over to the like, get in touch with me.
I'm telling you, that is the craziest sound of a Bigfoot that I've ever heard. I don't know if anyone has ever debunked it as of yet, but yeah, to me it is just absolutely crazy. So anyways, guys, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Yeah, we'll do this again tomorrow. I hope tomorrow you guys have a wonderful, blessed day. Be safe out there. And, yeah, peace out.